Buried alive in concrete. The psychological collapse inside ADX Florence. Before we begin, subscribe, like, and comment if you're ready to step inside the most secure prison in America, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning buried under concrete and steel. The alarm didn't echo. That was the first thing Officer Daniel Mercer noticed. Inside the control unit of ADX Florence, silence is normal. The walls swallow sound. The cells mute screams. But when Cell 214 stopped responding during the 3 a.m. mental health check, the quiet felt different, heavier. Inmate Thomas Grady hadn't moved in hours. Grady wasn't just another prisoner. He had once been a federal informant in a high-profile organized crime case, a man who turned on powerful associates and vanished into protective custody before eventually landing here, the so-called Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX Florence. 23 hours a day alone. 1 hour in a concrete recreation pen, barely bigger than a dog run. No human contact. No noise. No escape. When officers opened the steel slot to check his vitals, they saw something unsettling. Grady was sitting upright on his bunk, eyes wide open, staring at the wall as if it were speaking back to him. His knuckles were bleeding. The concrete in front of him was scratched raw. He kept repeating the same sentence. They're coming through the vents. There were no vents large enough for anything to pass through. Medical staff were called. Reports would later describe acute psychosis, paranoia, and self-inflicted injury. But what unsettled Mercer wasn't the blood or the rambling. It was Grady's file. Grady had no prior history of mental illness. 3 years earlier, psychological evaluations described him as stable, cooperative, resilient. Now, after 1,095 days in near-total isolation, he believed the walls were alive. ADX Florence was designed for the worst of the worst. Terrorists, cartel leaders, mass killers. Isolation was the point. Control was absolute. But in 2012, a federal class action lawsuit alleged that mentally ill inmates were being placed in solitary confinement for years, their conditions worsening without adequate treatment. Grady's name wasn't on that lawsuit, but his deterioration mirrored the claims. Officer Mercer filed an internal report that morning, noting severe mental decline. It should have been routine. It should have disappeared into paperwork like so many before it. Except later that week, Grady tried to gouge out his own eyes, screaming that the concrete was closing in. And when investigators reviewed the surveillance footage, they noticed something strange. For exactly 11 minutes before the incident, the camera outside cell 214 had gone dark. No explanation. No maintenance log. Just silence. But when they pulled Grady's sealed psychological review from storage, they found a handwritten note clipped to the inside cover, a note that wasn't supposed to exist. It read, "Isolation protocol extended beyond recommended limits. High risk of psychological fracture." And it was signed by a prison psychiatrist who had resigned abruptly 2 months earlier. That was the moment investigators realized this wasn't just a breakdown. It was a pattern, and someone had tried to hide it. The missing 11 minutes weren't supposed to matter. At ADX Florence, technical glitches were logged and forgotten. Cameras blinked. Systems reset. Life continued in silence. But when Special Agent Rebecca Nolan from the Department of Justice reviewed the outage report tied to Cell 214, something felt deliberate. The blackout wasn't random. It was isolated. Only the camera outside Thomas Grady's cell had gone dark. Every other feed in the range was functioning perfectly. Nolan had built her career investigating civil rights violations inside federal institutions. She wasn't looking for scandal. She was looking for proof. And proof inside a place like ADX Florence was almost impossible to extract. She requested Grady's full isolation log. The numbers were staggering. 3 years. Nearly continuous solitary confinement. Minimal psychological intervention. Repeated requests for evaluation marked as non-urgent. And then she found something else. 2 months before his breakdown, Grady had submitted a handwritten grievance. It never made it beyond internal review. In it, he claimed that prolonged isolation was causing auditory distortions, memory lapses, and intrusive paranoia. He begged for transfer to a step-down unit. The grievance had been denied in less than 48 hours. Reason: security classification prohibits modification. But Nolan noticed a pattern beyond Grady. 5 other inmates in the same control unit had experienced severe psychiatric deterioration within the past 18 months. Self-harm, psychotic episodes, suicide attempts, all after extended isolation periods exceeding internal guidelines, and all evaluated by the same prison psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Pierce. The same psychiatrist whose handwritten warning had been quietly filed inside Grady's review. Pierce had resigned without public explanation. When Nolan attempted to contact him, she learned he had relocated overseas. No forwarding address. No interviews. Just gone. Meanwhile, inside ADX, Officer Mercer began noticing subtle tension among staff. Supervisors discouraged conversation about Grady's incident. Reports were rewritten with softer language, behavioral disruption instead of psychological collapse. Mercer wasn't an activist. He believed in the mission of the prison. Dangerous men required containment. But he couldn't ignore what he had seen in cell 214, the vacant stare, the shredded knuckles, the slow unraveling of a man who had entered stable and deteriorated into someone unrecognizable. Then came the escalation. Another inmate, housed 2 tiers above Grady, attempted suicide after screaming for days that he could hear whispers inside the walls. His camera feed? Also dark for several unexplained minutes before the incident. Now it wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern of silence. Nolan formally requested internal maintenance logs for all camera outages over the past 2 years. The response was delayed, then partially redacted, then delayed again. Someone was stalling. And when Mercer discreetly provided Nolan with an unedited shift roster, she noticed something chilling. Every unexplained outage occurred during one specific overnight supervisor's shift. Lieutenant Craig Halvorson, a man with 22 years inside ADX. A man known for enforcing strict isolation without exception. When Nolan requested to interview Halvorson, she was told he was on emergency leave. No return date. No contact information. By the time she secured approval to escalate the inquiry, Halvorson's access badge had already been deactivated. He hadn't just taken leave. He had vanished. And somewhere inside the concrete silence of ADX Florence, the isolation units continued operating exactly as designed, swallowing sound, swallowing evidence, swallowing men whole. By the time Lieutenant Craig Halvorson disappeared, the story was no longer about one inmate's breakdown. It was about a system that might have been engineered to break them. Special Agent Rebecca Nolan pushed harder. Subpoenas were issued. Archived emails were recovered. Internal memos, once buried in digital storage, began surfacing like fragments of something long suppressed. One email stopped her cold. It was sent from Dr. Alan Pierce, the resigned prison psychiatrist, to Halvorson 18 months earlier. Subject line: isolation duration, clinical objection. In the message, Pierce warned that several inmates, including Thomas Grady, were exhibiting advanced psychological destabilization consistent with sensory deprivation trauma. He recommended immediate transfer to less restrictive housing. Halvorson's reply was brief. Security overrides clinical discomfort. That phrase would become central to the investigation. Nolan tracked financial disclosures next. Halvorson had recently purchased property in Montana, paid largely in cash. For a federal officer's salary, it didn't add up. Then another discovery surfaced. Thomas Grady's original cooperation agreement, the reason he was placed under extreme protection, had included testimony against members of a powerful criminal network. Some of those figures were serving life sentences in other federal facilities. But one name in that network had never been charged. A financier. Untouchable. Connected. And Nolan discovered that financier had indirect business ties to a private security consulting firm, a firm that had recently secured a federal contract advising on high-risk inmate management strategies. One of the firm's consultants? Craig Halvorson. The implication was chilling. If Grady deteriorated mentally, his credibility as a potential future witness weakened. If he fractured publicly, his testimony could be dismissed as unreliable. Isolation didn't just punish. It erased. Meanwhile, inside ADX, Officer Mercer faced growing pressure. Supervisors warned him to focus on duties. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. He found his locker searched twice. Then he received an anonymous envelope slipped under his windshield wiper in the employee parking lot. Inside were photocopies of extended isolation authorizations, signed not by medical staff, but by Halvorsen directly. Durations exceeded recommended limits by months. Attached was a handwritten note. "They're not protecting the prison. They're protecting someone else." The tension escalated when another inmate filed a federal complaint alleging deliberate indifference to mental health care. Advocacy groups picked up the story. Media inquiries began circling. ADX Florence had always been shielded by its reputation, necessary, impenetrable, unquestioned. Now that shield was cracking, Nolan secured a warrant to audit Halvorsen's deleted communications. What they uncovered wasn't just policy violations. It was coordination, encrypted messages, references to containment integrity. Discussions about ensuring certain inmates remained non-credible. Thomas Grady wasn't losing his mind by accident. The isolation had been deliberately extended. But before Nolan could move forward with federal charges, she received an urgent call. Thomas Grady had been found unresponsive in his cell. No signs of struggle. No suicide note. Just a body on a concrete floor, in a room designed to prevent exactly that. And this time, the camera hadn't gone dark. It had recorded everything. What the footage showed would force the nation to question not just one prison but the cost of burying a human being alive in silence. The footage was worse than anyone had anticipated. Nolan, Mercer, and a forensic analyst crowded into the review room, the glow of the monitor illuminating their faces. Cell 214 was silent, cold, and unforgiving. The camera captured everything, Grady pacing in circles for hours, muttering to himself, scraping at the concrete walls until his fingers bled. But then, almost imperceptibly, shadows shifted near the small steel door. It wasn't another inmate. ADX Florence didn't allow visitors inside the isolation units. A figure appeared, Halvorsen. Calm, deliberate, checking his watch, adjusting Grady's restraints. His presence confirmed what Nolan had feared. This wasn't just negligence. Someone with authority had been manipulating the conditions to ensure Grady's psychological collapse. The camera captured him leaving, unchallenged, before Mercer could intervene. Investigators pored over internal logs. Emails, memos, and deleted files painted a damning picture. Halvorsen had been systematically extending isolation periods for Grady and several other high-risk inmates. The rationale was chillingly pragmatic. Neutralize witnesses, maintain system integrity. Prisoners weren't merely confined, they were weaponized. Isolation wasn't protection. It was punishment designed to break minds. Nolan began connecting the dots. Grady's deterioration had undermined his credibility as a federal informant. His testimony against powerful criminal figures would never see the light of day. Every self-harm incident, every psychotic episode, was a domino Halvorsen had set in motion. The prison system, its walls, cameras, and guards, had become an instrument of silent coercion. But the story didn't end there. As the DOJ prepared charges, Halvorsen vanished completely. Attempts to track him overseas, through financial transactions and border records, hit dead ends. Every lead dissolved into shadows. Mercer, meanwhile, was transferred quietly out of the control unit, warned not to speak publicly. Whistleblowers inside ADX remained silent, fear etched into their faces. And then came the twist no one expected. A journalist uncovered a sealed federal report from 2012 detailing similar patterns of psychological collapse in other supermax facilities across the country. ADX Florence was only the most visible example. The system itself was complicit. Isolation protocols, understaffing, and bureaucratic indifference had created a network where men could literally be buried alive in concrete, without consequence. Thomas Grady's story became a warning. A man who had entered ADX Florence as a survivor, a witness, and a human being emerged, at least in memory, as a cautionary tale. Alone in his cell, stripped of interaction, stripped of hope, he exemplified what happens when power, fear, and concrete converge. As the investigation closed, one undeniable truth remained. ADX Florence hadn't just housed prisoners. It had tested the limits of human endurance, and some of its subjects didn't survive the test. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one, but one thing is certain. Inside these walls, the line between justice and cruelty is thinner than anyone can imagine. The story ends with a haunting reality. Some prisons don't just confine bodies, they bury minds alive, leaving silence to do what no one dares to witness.